And I think maybe if I...
We're set.
All right. Do I just launch?
Just launch.
Okay. All right. For my presentation, I want to talk about what I'm calling modes of explanation of complex phenomena. And I think one of the basic messages is that contemporary scientific studies of complexity in biology and in social science and elsewhere have generated new domains for philosophical thinking in terms of what counts as an explanation, what are the kinds of phenomena we're explaining. And in particular, it's my view that the complexities and the contingencies of the structures that biologists, psychologists, neuroscientists, social scientists explore have major implications for the epistemology of explanation, and therefore have generated new modes of explanation. In part, this is a result of the complexity of the structures themselves, which is, for me, characterized in terms of structures that have multi-level organization. Think of a social insect colony, think of the brain, think of a social institution, that have multi-component causal interactions. So there's many different causes, often weak, that collaborate, if you like, to generate features of this complex structure. And it displays plasticity in relation to variation in context, either internal or external. So it's a responsive, dynamic structure. It's not fixed, its parts aren't fixed, things change, and it changes in response to them. And this is, as is clear, a very useful adaptive mechanism for living in a world that itself is changing and living in a world where the structures are built on, in some sense, unreliable components. So having these kinds of responsive plastic interactions is a way of solving a lot of problems for a structure when internal and external context changes. In addition to these features of complexity, the structures that are studied by neuroscience, biology, social science are also more contingent. They display historical and local dependencies that contribute to the generation of their behaviors, and therefore have to be taken into account in explaining why we see what we see in the world now. Why do we have the structures we have now? Why do they behave the way they do now? So my emphasis is going to be on the kinds of implications of those features of complex structures for explanation. And I'm going to focus today on two implications. One is on the now scientifically legitimate category of emergent phenomena and emergent properties. And the second is on a recharacterization of the lawful behaviors, or the lawfulness that explains evolved, contingent, complex phenomena. So the 2 points I'd like to make for discussion, which I hope there's a lot of, have to do with emergence and contingency. So let me turn to emergence first. Complex structures display what have both traditionally and more recently been identified as emergent properties. We're all familiar with the old characterization attributed to Aristotle that the whole is more than the sum of its parts. But for many decades, that identifying something as emergent property was considered to be unscientific, that science was a reductive enterprise, and that everything at a higher level of organization should be and could be, in principle, explained by appeal solely to the properties of the components that constituted that complex structure. Much of this was developed in the British emergentist literature from Mill onwards through Lloyd Morgan and Broad, and is continued to be endorsed, this characterization of emergentism. continues to be endorsed by contemporary philosophers like Jaegwon Kim and others, particularly working in the philosophy of mind. And this characterization of emergence is made up of really three features. That emergent properties are supposed to be novel, unpredictable, and display downward causation. And the characterization in by the British emergentists and many contemporary philosophers is in terms of what can't be explained by. So it's an epistemological characterization and suggests that anything that you can't explain in a reductive way is emergent, but that there are no such things. What's surprising is that, at least, and you can track this on Google Ngrams, and also just by a quick Google search, is that contemporary science has re-embraced the notion of emergence in ways that are really quite striking. And it's my contention that the contemporary scientific understanding of emergence is a really legitimate explanatory category which shares many of the features of the traditional notion, but not all of them. And so what I would like to say is that emergence is something that is found in the study of complex phenomena. It's an important feature of complex phenomena. It's not that every feature of a complex structure is emergent, but many are, and those are in need of and are receiving explanations that are different than the reductive ones that we had come to expect that would be carried out for all properties at all levels of organization. So there's a new kind of phenomena, if you like, emergent structures. And let me give you a couple of quotes, is that okay, of what that means. Okay, so emergence sometimes is defined, and this is in Goldstein, 1999, as the arising of novel and coherent structures, patterns, and properties during the process of self-organization in complex systems. So self-organization is one of the mechanisms or modes in which higher order properties can be generated, and then there's other, if you like, causal interactions that stabilize them at that higher level. Karsanti in 2008 said dynamic organization emerges from the collective behavior of agents, the individual properties of which cannot account for the properties of the final dynamic pattern. So there's a lot of interest in not just in how these higher level properties, for example, how the division of labor, the partitioning of individuals in a social insect colony has the character it has. Why are there so many individuals who are tending brood and so many individuals that are foraging? And amongst the foragers, why are there individuals foraging for nectar and those who are foraging for pollen? How are these various features of the structure that are made up by the collective behaviors, if you like, of the individuals, how do they emerge, and how are they stabilized, and how do we explain them? So the patterns of that are counted as emergent are often patterns of biological aggregations, schooling fish, flocking birds, and they display a lot of features that also may be characterized by chaotic dynamics. So there's a lot of features of these higher level structural properties that invite us to re-examine what we think of as a legitimate mode of explanation. Reductionism, which in many philosophers of biology, especially in many philosophers in general, have seen it to be not the whole story. That what's the alternative to reductive explanations? I think this new concentration on these higher level emergent properties has impelled us to give a different characterization of how explanation works in those cases. So let's talk about, in particular, let me give you one example, and then we can talk about what's the change in the mode of explanation that's required to embrace it. Well, let me give you two examples. Nobody expected the Spanish. Anyway, you're going to cut all that out, right?
Of course.
So So let me talk about
That's why I'm listening for the rain to see when it's going, because I'm waiting for it to start really pounding on the air conditioner, so that we're going to have to stop for the few minutes because it's going to go bang, 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 bang.
It will do that.
Yeah.
It's actually quite dramatic up here. So let me talk about just two simple examples to give, and there's many, many that you can find in the literature to give a flavor of the kind of thing that I think is generating this new interest in explanatory character. One is chemotaxis in E. coli. So E. coli is a bacterium, and what it does is it tracks nutrients in a medium in which it's swimming around, and it has two kinds of behaviors. It has a tumbling behavior, right, and it has a non-tumbling behavior, and it adapts its behavior to the chemical gradients in its environment. So it turns out that the change of a chemical stimulant induces a rapid change in its tumbling frequency, right, which is how one of these plastic responses that I was talking about that complex systems are able to produce. And what's interesting about this is that you can, in fact, change almost all of the internal components of the bacterium and still get the behavior. So it's not a dedicated behavior that you would explain by the presence or absence of some component or set of components. It's not the presence or absence of a component that is going to then generate this higher level of behavior, but rather the ways in which the system responds robustly, that is, in the face of deletions of internal components, to generate something very similar to that behavior. So that kind of robustness is one feature of emergent properties. They're not just dependent on the aggregation of the presence and absence of components. They're dependent on the dynamic responses of the system to the absence of components as well as the external and internal environments. So there's little change in the metabolic function of chemotaxis, even if you change a lot of the genes that code for the components that make it up. That's another sound we get here. Another one. And let me give you another example of a system I spent a lot of time working on, and that's the social insects. And this is a case where I believe there's evidence of downward causation. That you might look at a honeybee colony and ask the question, what causes a particular individual bee to fly out of the nest to forage for nectar at a particular time? And again, some of the answers that you would expect from a reductive account would be, well, this bee has the genes that code for a certain threshold of response to the stimulus that it's given, and that explains why it forages and why another one doesn't. They have different genetic makeups. One's a nectar forager, one is a pollen forager, and that's why this one forages for nectar and this one doesn't. And that's a bottom-up explanation. Now, that's a piece of the story, but that's not going to explain, that's not going to be reliable to get the whole story about why a particular bee goes out and forages for nectar at a particular time. And you can, of course, ask why this whole class of bees does it, why do they have this distribution in the population, but let's start and focus on the individual. Well, you might say one of the answers to this, I think, is very intriguing, is that the behavior of the individual is responsive to a property of the colony of a whole. And what is that property? That property is how much nectar is in fact stored already in the colony. So the system, the colony, the higher level system, has a property that's not a property of an individual bee, namely how much nectar it has stored, that influences the behavior of the individual bees to go out and forage for nectar and bring it back to the colony. Well, how does it get that nectar? It's produced by all the individual bees going out and foraging for nectar and bringing it back and storing it. So there's a sense in which this higher level property is generated by the behavior of the individuals, right? But at the same time, their own behavior is influenced by that higher level property. So what's intriguing about this particular system is you say, well, what did the bees do? They come in, they have, they look at the Excel spreadsheet and it says we have this much nectar stored, we don't need any more. Of course they can't do that. There's no centralized account of what there is. There's nobody directing them to do what they're doing. There's a system of self-organization whereby the information about what's stored in the colony is available to them in terms of the waiting time they have to unload the nectar they bring in. So the way the system works is this. So there's an explanation of how this works, right? But it's an explanation that depends on the higher order property, which itself is generated by the behavior of the individuals. You can see this as a complicated feedback system, right? But it's a feedback system that can't leave out of the story the emergent property of the amount of nectar that's stored. So how it works is an individual bee flies out to collect nectar and returns to the colony. What happens next is that there are other bees in the colony that unload the nectar that's being carried back and then fly around internally to find an empty cell in which to deposit it. Now, while they're doing that, another bee lands. So the bee who's coming in with its nectar has to wait for the unloading bee to return. And the time it takes for the unloading bee to return is directly correlated with how many empty cells there are. There's a lot of empty cells, it doesn't take very long. If it's very full, it takes a long time to find an empty cell. And so the waiting time, if you like, reflects this higher level property and then influences the probability that that bee will return to foraging. And so there's a way in which I would argue this is an example of downward causation, namely the higher level property is changing the behavior of the components which themselves generate the higher order property. You can't detect this kind of emergent behavior if you just take a snapshot of the system and see what are the properties and how do they stand with respect to each other. You have to look at the dynamics of the system, of how the higher order property itself gets established, maintained, and how the behavior of the individual components that are involved in establishing it themselves get changed by the properties of that higher order structure. So one of the things that happens in emergence is that there are these, in order to explain the behavior of the E. coli or of the individual honeybee, you have to appeal to things that are, if you like, at a higher level of organization. This, in fact, and robustness of behavior in the E. coli, the feedback mechanisms that tune, if you like, the behaviors of the individual bees to the needs of the colony. These are things that are dynamic processes of feedback, feed forward, robust stabilization, right? And sometimes display also chaotic dynamics. And what's interesting is that one of the things then that I think is important about not whether there's emergence or not emergence, what do we mean by emergence, what are the degrees of emergence, but the whole exploration of the way in which these emergent structures are understood and explained, I think induce a really fundamental shift in our mode of explanation. We have to give up a kind of static view that I can explain higher level properties by just looking at the components that constitute that in a snapshot instant of time. I will not be able to understand how to explain these higher order properties unless I look at the dynamics of self-organization, feedback, feed-forward, and chaotic interactions. That it's that dynamic perspective that these kinds of explanations demand that some frameworks for explanation have not been able to accommodate. And that's what I think the philosophical challenge is that comes from some of the work in dynamics, in the new understanding of what I now call dynamic emergence. That it has, now dynamic emergence satisfies, if you like, the letter of the law. It has unpredictable properties. In particular, how the structure arises has been associated with chaotic dynamics, which are by definition unpredictable. Okay? You see that in bird flocking and in other mass aggregate behaviors. It displays novelty. The structures of the higher order are not possessed by any of the individual components. They're not even possessed by an aggregation of the individual components. They're possessed as a result of the dynamic interactions of the components and external context and internal context. And if you like, the gold standard of emergence they display downward causation. Namely, when properties of the whole change the behavior of the constituent parts by positive and negative feedback, right, and they become stabilized by the behavior of the components, this permits this kind of multi-level, if you like, causal relevance or causal dependence. And although there's a reductive character to it, namely, we're not saying that this higher level property emerges independently of the components, to understand both its properties and its stability, and the properties of the components, you need to appeal to higher and lower levels, and downward causation, I think, is an appropriate way of classifying those. So I think so the big change, I think, that is generated by the new understanding of emergence is this shift from a kind of static understanding of how I explain properties by appealing to properties, to suggesting that I explain properties by appealing to dynamic processes. And for those, I think emergence is appropriate. I think that's what scientists are characterizing by appeal to emergence, right? And that's what the philosophical understanding of the explanation of emergence has to embrace. My second point.
Hang on, I'm going to interrupt you for a minute.
Please.
Only because, before I forget it, I was at a Santa Fe Institute thing a few months ago. Mm-hmm. There's a lady, and I will get you the reference, who does her work on ants.
Deborah Gordon?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, fine. I know her work, yeah.
Okay, fine, all right.
Yes, so there's
because what you described about the bees is what she describes about the ants.
This is not a unique phenomenon.
Yeah.
And the phenomena have lots of there's lots of different variations, right, on exactly how much the properties of the components contribute to the property of the higher level structure, how much or what features of the components is contingent on or dependent on the properties of the higher level. And so, but social insects are a nice system in which to explore these features, because they come in lots of shapes and sizes. So there's a lot of variety amongst the social insects themselves, and so they're available, if you like, for exploring the possibility space for emergent behaviors, and you can also do experiments on them. So my early work in the 1980s, in collaboration with entomologist Rob Page, we developed a self-organization simulation for division of labor in honeybees based on Stuart Kaufman's NK model of complexity, where we gave to our computer bees the properties that were characteristic of solitary bees. And we generated simulations to show that with just those properties and, if you like, compatibility or aggregation, division of labor falls out as a structural feature of that higher level colony. What was interesting is that later work with Jennifer Fuel and Rob Page did experimental work on that model to force solitary insects to live together to see what would happen. And in fact, the predictions that you get certain features of division of labor in Kaufman's were for free, not as a result of adaptive selection on that feature, but as a result of the way in which higher order structures are generated and stabilized. Turns out that in the experimental work, by forcing these poor ants who normally would not associate with each other to live in a collectively, all those features came out. So this work isn't just hypothetical. This work has both, modeling support and as well as empirical support.
Yeah. And you've just then reflected on, I don't know if you and I have ever had my Prigogine conversation.
I don't think we've had, but I know Prigogine's work.
Okay,
and there's actually modeling that's based on that through
right, so
Jean-Louis Dudenberg and others.
Prigogine's last major public appearance was at a conference in Belgium. Mm-hmm. And it's a complexity conference, and he's giving the talk, and me being the normal disrespectful person that I am, at the end of the talk, I stuck up my hand and I said, it's marvelous that you're here, et cetera, et cetera. But I have something in your work has confused me ever since I've started. Why did you use the word self-organization when there was no self? And the man says, the greatest mistake of my life. I meant self-contained.
Oh, that's odd.
I did not mean self. Mm-hmm. And the meme, if you want to use that word, took off ahead of me, and I never got control of it again.
Was he the first one who introduced the language of self-organization?
Yes.
I didn't know that. It's interesting. It has been a confusing term, although
says,
I think it's now occupies a pretty clear place in
like the description
lexicon.
You just gave,
yeah.
You forced the animals to live together. You applied you gave them a boundary, and now this happened, which is exactly what Prigogine meant by it.
Right. Well, that's good then.
Yes, that's my point. You just gave a perfect example of what he meant.
Right.
And why he hated the meme that took off away from him. He didn't mean that somehow those animals now decided that they had unionized. And that there was now the union of the ants that was a self that was going to now do the following things.
Right. That's right.
He meant these poor things were, as you said, found themselves confronted by a boundary that they didn't expect, and now they have to adapt.
Yeah, their behavior is responsive. That's the point. That it's just a bunch of individuals in an environment acting in a certain way that can, not always, generate a higher order, stabilized structure that feeds back on their very own behavior. Right. So one of the things that's really interesting in the transition from solitary to social insects, that a major evolutionary transition to sociality, is that many of the individual behaviors are lost, right? They get constrained and then new structures arise. So what's interesting is that that's an evolutionary transition that's happened certainly in the social insects independently about 11 to 17 times. And evolutionarily, some social insects have evolved to solitaries again. So there's no necessity, in a way, generating, in the kind of 19th century Victorian anthropological sense that, things start out in small associations and get bigger ones and bigger ones. I mean, the industrial society and, social insects have often been political models, too, of division of labor in human societies. But rather that this is something that happens in the dynamics of interaction. And that's what self-organization picks up. Good. So my conclusion on the emergence is that emergence in modern scientific explanations identifies an important class of phenomena that requires a revision in what we can appeal to generate explanations of those phenomena. Philosophically, we need to represent the dynamic stabilization of properties, not their presence or absence. The unfolding of new structures, new laws governing their behavior, and feedback and feed-forward processes that engage entities at multiple levels of organization. So you can see this appeal to multiplicity is one of the what's the word I want? Is one of the non-reductive movements, right? That this appeal to the necessity to appeal to multiple levels is a non-reductive explanation, and that the appeal to the dynamics of behaviors is a non-static explanation. So both reduction and static approaches to explanation, I think, are inadequate to accommodate these new developments. Why we have to have new modes of explanation to accommodate them. Okay. My second point that I wanted to raise about an implication for explanation that comes out of the contemporary study of complex and evolved systems has to do with the role of contingencies. Now, there's often in philosophical accounts, and you find it in scientific writings too, an appeal that you need to explain particular phenomena by appeal to the laws that govern them. And there's been a long tradition of trying to characterize what it is that counts as a law of nature or a law of science among philosophers that has typically been described in terms of universal law, exceptionalist laws that carry with them a natural necessity. So there's something naturally necessary, universal, and exceptionalist about the relationship between falling bodies, right, and the gravitational constant of the Earth, right? There's something, you can't just change it if you want. There's something necessary about it, and it's universally followed. Okay, there could be confounders, et cetera, but that law holds. So there's this understanding that there are these universal generalizations that are exceptionlessly true, and that's what explains why you have connections between cause and effect. And this is an old story. Okay? Now, it's also part of the old story that this model fails to apply to most of biology. Okay? And that's been, and there's been various questions about why that is the case. Okay? So laws are things that describe causal structures in our world, right? And they explain phenomena and events. So laws are implicated in explanations, and they also allow us to predict future events. The problem is that these kinds of generalizations, universal, exceptionless, and naturally necessary, don't really apply to evolved complex biological structures. And one of that's often been identified as the problem that there are no laws in biology. And now we might ask the question, why does the knowledge of biological systems, like the ones we've just been talking about, fail to fit the standard account of laws? What's wrong? Is it that biology is still in its infancy, and someday maybe has its Galileo, it hasn't got its Newton yet, so is it the infancy of the science that it hasn't established these laws yet, but that's something that will come later? Or is there something else responsible for this failure to fit the standard account of laws? The features that biological generalizations have, let's take an example, like just say Mendel's law, which has the TAD law, the Mendel's law of segregation, which is when you have a sexually reproducing organism, the gametes that are produced in eggs and sperm are have a 50-50, there's a 50-50 distribution of the parental genes, or the parental genetic information that's appears in the gametes. Okay, and that's Mendel's law. It turns out it's not universal. There are exceptions to it. It's called meiotic drive or segregation distortion. There's a couple of different mechanisms that generate this exception. Okay, so it's not universally true, even of all current and, for what we know of the past, sexually reproducing organisms. And secondly, it doesn't seem to be very necessary. It seems that things could have evolved in a very different way, such that this feature, this lawful truth generalization, wasn't lawful and true. Okay, that it could have been a different distribution of gametes. It could have been 30-70, or there might not have been sexually reproducing organisms. There might not have been 2 parents. There might have been 3 parents, or 10 parents, or 1 parent. So all of the features of evolved organisms seem to have this evolutionary contingency. Those structures, in some sense, didn't have to occur in the same way as we might think that the kind of structures in ideal gases, right? The kinds of relationships describing those had to occur. You'd have to change. It's hard. Those kinds of more fundamental physical laws seem to be exceptionless, right? Or at least, I would say, less contingent than these more ephemeral structures that occur in biology. And take the story even to social institutions, right? Did we have to have a parliamentary structure in English government? Oh, there's lots of ways in which that could have been very different. It's often these arguments about contingency have been. I attribute a lot of the recent interest in that to work by John Beatty on his evolutionary contingency thesis, who wants to explain the reason why biology has laws by suggesting it's due to the contingency of the structures, and therefore the contingency of the causal relations that describe and explain those structures, and therefore biology doesn't have laws, right? But I would like to suggest there's different responses to this problem that biology fails to have laws, and characterizing it in terms of contingency. this mismatch between biological knowledge and this standard view of laws. Some have argued that biology just doesn't have laws. Okay, that's one move you can make. You can say, okay, biology studies contingent, ephemeral, not necessary structures and the relations that describe them, so it doesn't have laws. People like Beatty, actually, I think, take that view, as does Robert Brandon, and in some readings of Jim Woodward, he also adopts that view. But maybe that's not so bad. People like Nancy Cartwright argued and Woodward argued because science doesn't actually need laws like that, right, to explain. You can explain with something less than universal, exceptionalist, necessary generalizations. Others have argued that biology does have laws. Okay, so but on the standard account of laws, but there are not very many of them. These may be ceteris paribus laws, or they're very abstract. Maybe they're mathematical truths. These are people like Elliot Sober, Ken Waters. They have argued. They say, no, we have laws on the old model. Some say, no, we don't have laws on the old model. And what I have tried to argue in my work is that biology does have laws, but we have to revise the standard account. We have to understand what's going on with laws that allow them to be explanatory, and see that, in fact, biology has explanatory laws, but they don't follow the old standard model. So that's the kind of conceptual space in which I think the debate about laws, at least pieces of the conceptual space that the debate about laws and their failure to apply to biology has occupied. And it's kind of a Chinese menu list. You can choose yes, no laws in biology, standard view. Yes, laws in biology, standard view, although they're very odd-looking laws, like Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Or, yes, laws in biology, reject the standard view. And it's the third one that I want to suggest is the appropriate way. And again, it's a view that takes the same kind of form, that what we're learning about complex, evolved systems, right, has an impact on our philosophical conception of explanation by appeal to laws. Okay, so again, the move is to suggest that contemporary science is showing us that there are modes of explanation, right, in this case appealing to contingent laws, that need to be characterized philosophically in order to keep up with, like, the scientific discoveries and understandings that are being developed. So what do I mean by contingency? It's clear that all natural truths, right, are logically contingent. There's this argument, okay, in logic we have these two really nice clean boxes. If you have first order predicate logic, all A's or B's. Okay, that is either a logical truth with logical necessity, or it's a contingent truth that depends on what the A's and B's are. All A's are A, that's a logical truth. It's necessary. All A's are B, that's a contingent truth. You have to go look at the A's and the B's to find out whether that's true. Okay. What I think has happened is that language of logical necessity, which is a nice, clean, dichotomous structure, has been carried over into apply to natural necessity by analogy. That truths that we have about the world are either naturally necessary, right? Like there is, and this is a philosophical, often referred to example, there are no spheres of uranium larger than 100 meters in diameter because it becomes unstable and it would implode, right? That's a naturally necessary true generalization compared to an accidental, unnecessary true generalization, like there is no sphere of gold that has a diameter more than 100 meters. Right? So the argument is just being true of our universe isn't enough for it to be a law. It has to display this thing called necessity, I think modeled after logical necessity. The argument is that I think that all natural, everybody agrees all laws of science and laws of nature are true of our world and not any logically possible world. So they're all logically contingent, but then we, if you like, iterate this dichotomy between naturally necessary and naturally contingent, and I think that that fails to characterize is this kind of knowledge we have of nature. That gives us only a dichotomous choice. Everything's either in the one box, naturally necessary, or the other box, contingent. As it turns out, almost nothing is in the naturally necessary, universal, exceptionless box, right? Almost everything we know, and I might argue everything we know, but we're very hard pressed to find any scientific laws of fundamental physics, of non-fundamental physics, of chemistry, of biology, of anything that has these features that are supposed to be the features of a law, and the law is needed in order to generate explanations. So we're in trouble here. And my argument is that this dichotomous contingent versus necessity is the wrong conceptual framework. Rather, that there are dependencies in nature, right? And they come in degrees. It's not all in one box or the other box. That there are degrees, if you like, of contingency. There's different degrees of dependency. There's more ephemeral. There's more rigid structures. There's structures that have endured since after the first 3 minutes after the Big Bang, and there's those that come and go. And these are all things that we can get knowledge of, but the knowledge is not going to, all of these pieces of knowledge are going to fit into the not naturally necessary box. So having this kind of dichotomous framework doesn't give us the right tools to really understand the kind of knowledge and the kind of ways in which true generalizations can explain what occurs in our universe. So my suggestion has been that what we should think about in terms of laws is not whether they satisfy this dichotomous strict law model, but rather think about them in terms of what their functions are. What is it that laws do? And what kinds of truths, if you like, what kinds of shapes of truths can satisfy that function? And it turns out we can explain, predict, and intervene in the world with things that don't satisfy the strict notion of laws. Laws are what science allegedly looks to discover about nature. It explains why what happens. They explain that. They permit us to predict what will happen in the future or in other circumstances. And they provide us the tools to intervene in the world in order to achieve our pragmatic goals. Going to the moon, building a bridge, curing cancer. We want to know what the laws are governing those systems so that we can produce the effects that satisfy what our pragmatic goals are. And there's lots of truths that can do that fail to meet the strict notion. So what I would argue is that the differences between physics and biology, or the differences between looking at very simple systems and looking at complex systems, and especially complex evolved systems, which display lots of forms of contingencies and dependencies. There are differences between those systems, but they're not the difference between having laws and not having laws. They're different. The invariance is true in physics and chemistry. May be true for a wider scope of things. They may be less, if you like, destabilized, interrupted. They may have fewer exceptions, but they just have different degrees of contingency. It's not that one provides laws and the other does not. So generalizations true of fundamental physics are different from those that are true of biological systems, but they're true in this kind of continuum or degree fashion rather than in this dichotomous one. So I think what looking at the contingency of the truths we can get of these complex structures, complex, evolved, varyingly dependent structures, has indicated is that explanations can still be had, but they appeal to generalizations that cover not everything for all times exceptionlessly, but these kinds of things under these kinds of circumstances for these kinds of stimuli, these kinds of inputs. And so in order to use these what I call pragmatic laws to generate explanations, we have to do something a little different than using strict laws for explanations. If I have a strict law, I know it applies everywhere and for all times, and I don't need to know anything about the context, right? There's nothing that's going to disrupt it. It's necessary that it occurs, right? For these pragmatic laws, I need to know more. I need to know not just what the relationship that's being described between gamete production and frequency of gametes, right? But I need to know whether or not the contextual circumstances are ones that are generating meiotic drive, for example. In this example, I need to know whether I'm dealing with a sexually reproducing organism, which may have occurred only in certain periods in the evolution of life and not in other periods in the evolution of life. So explanation is going to take a different shape, right? But it's going to not fail to be explanatory. It's going to appeal to laws, but not all of them are going to be strict laws. Some are going to be more or less contingent laws. So the upshot of these two pieces of the ways in which I think contemporary understanding of complex structures influences our understanding of explanation, to me suggests that there is pluralism in modes of explanation. There's not one size fits all. Not everything's reductive explanation by appeal to strict laws, right? But instead, there are multiple modes of explanation that are tuned to the kinds of phenomena that populate our world. Okay? They're not that part of what's generating the change in our understanding of explanation is that the more we understand about nature, the more different kinds of things we discover. And our accounts of explanation and the modes of explanation need to accommodate that kind of variety that generates a type of pluralism in explanatory styles. In addition, I think what these new developments in science have indicated is that we have to look at dynamical processes, right, in order to explain features, and not just look at the static presence and absence of properties in order to explain features, especially higher order emergent features, and that we need to understand the ways in which various properties we want to explain, predict, and intervene on depend contingently on other factors, including the context in which those properties occur. Thank you.
Great. So now I get to ask you a couple of questions.
You can ask me anything you want.
Okay, so we'll start with the easy one and work our way to the hard one.
Oh, good. Okay.
What is an explanation?
Well, I think, again, you get choices here. For me, an explanation is an account of because I locate, and I think there's other kinds, but for me, what I'm focused on are scientific explanations, and I think typically the ones that I think are important to account for causal explanations. So it's what is it that's generating, producing, and or responsible for, okay, a particular factor event that I want to explain. So this responsibility isn't just causal, it just isn't all generative causation. So one of the things that's interesting, for example, there's a current debate in philosophy of science between looking at causation in terms of invariances, which is, for me, a type of causal dependence that permits these kinds of degrees of contingency. I think that's a very attractive account. If I want to explain why something occurs rather than not occurs, I can appeal to things that it depends on in order to occur. There's an alternative, which is a mechanistic approach, which is a much more generative account of explanation that says if I want to explain why this occurs, I have to tell you all the things in the past that produced it. Okay. What's interesting is if you look actually at contemporary psychology of human beings' understanding of causation, there's two very different notions of causation that we operate with psychologically that seem to map onto these different accounts of causal explanation, mechanistic and invariance accounts. And sometimes what we want from a causal explanation is all the pieces that it took to generate that effect. Certainly, if you're trying to produce something, you better have all the pieces that you need to generate that effect, right? And sometimes what we want from a causal explanation is to know why that guy did that and this guy didn't. And you don't need to know all the pieces that generated the effect in the case where it occurred. You just need to know what the difference was. That was responsible, if you like, for the occurrence in one case and the absence in another. And so people use causation, human beings use causation, according to psychological research, in both these ways. And so it's, again, there's a kind of, for me, a pluralism in what it is that counts as a causal explanation, even though I've restricted myself to causal explanations, both in terms of causal dependence and in terms of generating, in a kind of mechanistic way, how we got there, as opposed to what's the difference between being there and not being there. So I think both of those, for me, count as causal explanations. I think there's non-causal explanations as well, but I think science tends to be looking for the causal explanations as a way to predict and especially to intervene in the world to generate effects that we want to produce or prevent effects we don't want to produce.
And do you have words of wisdom for the conference attendees?
You lucky dogs. I wish I could be there. I think this kind of dialogue and Socratic interaction, if you like, is a really important way of generating progress in philosophy. And I think that having all the participants really engage with each other, I think is bound to lead to some really interesting insights, and I look forward to hearing the results.
Great.
Thank you.